fighting for a piece of land you've sworn to protect, only to discover it's the very target of those who wish to destroy you. And in that fight, struggling to tell who is a friend and who is an enemy. But the real blow comes when you think the danger has passed. The battle at Blackwood Ranch was more than a fight for an inheritance. It was a test of life, loyalty, and belief itself. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. I never imagined my life would change in the span of a single morning. One moment I was hauling feed to the stables behind Miller's livery, wiping sweat from my brow as the sun clawed its way above the dusty horizon. The next, an unfamiliar man with a worn leather satchel and a solemn look was standing in front of me, declaring that my life, mine, was about to belong to someone else entirely. His name was Henry Gentry, a lawyer whose presence carried the sort of authority that demanded obedience, even before words were spoken. He opened the satchel carefully, almost ceremoniously, and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with crimson wax. It might as well have been a message from another world, for that wax and the documents within promised a future I had never imagined. "You are Samuel Whittaker?" he asked, though his eyes betrayed that he already knew the answer. I nodded, expecting perhaps some routine business, maybe a letter from a distant relative. What I got instead was an inheritance. Massive, bewildering, and terrifying. 2,000 acres of sprawling farmland, a main house that could swallow half the town, livestock numbering in the hundreds, and outbuildings I could hardly identify without a guide. My mind struggled to accept it. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. The condition, Henry explained with meticulous care, was one that froze my blood. I was to marry a woman I had never met. Not a neighbor, not someone from my past, but a stranger, her name unfamiliar even on paper, her life unknown to me, yet somehow intricately tied to the fate of this sprawling ranch. I remembered the morning clearly. My back still sticky with sweat from mucking out the stalls, my fingers raw from handling the horses. I had laughed, thinking it a mistake. There was no Jonathan Blackwood, no grand ranch, nothing in my past that hinted at such wealth. Yet Henry's face remained as stern as a judge's, the documents as unyielding as the law itself. "Your wife is waiting in town," he said finally, and the name rolled off his tongue like a prophecy I could not refuse. Lila Crawford. I had never heard of her. She had never heard of me. And yet, in the span of an hour, we were to be married, bound by a contract that had been drafted decades before either of us had drawn breath. When I arrived at the boarding house where she had been staying, my first glance at Lila made the absurdity of our situation even more tangible. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded, eyes steady and calm, as if she had been anticipating this moment for a lifetime. But in those eyes, I saw hints of fear, resignation, and something else, calculating survival. There was no time for introductions. No small talk. The lawyer's warning echoed in my head: refuse the contract, and the inheritance would revert to the state. Accept it, and we would own a vast estate, with all its responsibilities, secrets, and perils. The ride to Blackwood Ranch was longer than I expected, stretching across rolling hills dotted with cedar and sagebrush, the earth dry and cracked under the late afternoon sun. I gripped the reins, my knuckles white, while Lila sat beside me, quiet, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she could see what lay ahead more clearly than I could. Every so often, she would adjust her dress, a simple cotton affair that belied the wealth we were about to inherit. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a trap. And perhaps, in some ways, we were. When the ranch finally emerged over the next ridge, my breath caught in my throat. The main house stood proudly atop a gentle rise, 2 stories of timber and stone, a wraparound porch polished by years of care. Behind it, a massive barn, its roof freshly shingled, corral fences sturdy and new, cattle grazing in pastures that stretched toward the horizon. I had expected desolation. I had expected neglect. Instead, I found prosperity, meticulously maintained, and ready for someone to claim. A man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked old enough to have weathered a lifetime under the sun, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. I would soon learn his name: Pete Henley, caretaker, overseer, and the keeper of secrets that would shape my understanding of the Blackwood legacy. He acknowledged Lila with a measured nod and me with a quiet, almost reluctant respect. "You'll need to know the ranch," he said simply, gesturing toward the main house. "There's much more to it than land and livestock. The business, the agreements, the debts, they all come with ownership. And they've been waiting for someone to claim them." I swallowed hard. This wasn't inheritance, it was initiation. A baptism of fire into a world I had never imagined, where wealth was intertwined with deception, old grudges, and the cold calculus of power. As we walked toward the house, my eyes caught the carved initials on the porch post, SW plus LC, beneath a date from 15 years past. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been planning this union, orchestrating our lives like pieces on a chessboard, long before either of us had arrived in this world. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting the ranch in a golden light that was both beautiful and ominous. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge that our lives were about to be entangled in a web of old debts, hidden agreements, and dangerous ambitions that we could neither ignore nor escape. And as the house loomed larger, the truth settled in my chest like a stone. This was more than land. It was legacy, danger, and a destiny that had chosen me without my consent. The first steps inside Blackwood Ranch felt heavier than the wagon ride up the hill. The main house smelled of polished wood and aged leather, the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the corners, mixed with the earthy tang of livestock carried in from the fields. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots seemed amplified, each echo a reminder that I had crossed into a life I neither chose nor understood. Pete Henley guided us to a study at the rear of the house, a room that seemed more like a fortress of paper than a living space. Shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers, maps marked with ink and pencil, and documents stacked in careful piles gave away the true nature of the inheritance. The ranch was not merely land and livestock. It was a network of business dealings, grazing rights, and trade agreements that had been carefully nurtured and guarded for decades. I ran a hand across the surface of the desk, feeling the weight of what was to come. Every paper whispered secrets, every mark on the map hinted at alliances, conflicts, and debts settled or unsettled. I had expected a simple inheritance, the kind that required signing a few documents and collecting a deed. Instead, it felt like stepping into a chess game that had been in play for 20 years. One in which my father and Jonathan Blackwood had been pieces manipulated by forces I could barely begin to understand. Lila followed silently, her steps measured, eyes sharp. She had never met me before today, and yet I sensed a shared understanding, a mutual recognition of the stakes we faced. There was no time to question why, no space to debate morality or hesitation. Blackwood Ranch was alive with history, and it demanded respect, caution, and intelligence to survive. Pete pulled a photograph from one of the drawers, an image yellowed with age but still vivid. 3 men stood outside the barn we had passed, their postures confident, their gazes fixed on a future none of them could fully predict. The man in the center, tall and broad-shouldered, was unmistakably Jonathan Blackwood. To my horror, the man on the left was my father, Daniel Whitaker. The third man, slightly older and sharp-eyed, was Samuel Crawford, Lila's father. I stared at the photograph, the reality sinking in slowly, painfully. My father and Jonathan Blackwood had been partners. They had built the ranch together, shared profits, and forged agreements that bound their futures, and, unknowingly, ours. My father's gambling debts had put him in Crawford's crosshairs, a predator waiting for the right moment. Pete opened a thick folder and laid out a contract, yellowed but meticulously preserved. Daniel Whitaker had signed over his share of the ranch to Blackwood, securing a promise that if he ever had a son, that son would inherit the estate, and if Blackwood took a wife, Daniel's son would marry her daughter. The years fell into place with horrifying clarity. Every struggle of my childhood, every hardship, every loss, now traced back to this very contract. Lila's presence beside me shifted from simple necessity to clarity. She was not Blackwood's daughter, but Crawford's. And Crawford, with decades to plan, had sought to manipulate the same contract to seize the ranch for himself. The legal stipulations, the threats, the forced marriage, all of it was a chess move, and we were the pawns he hoped to control. Pete's voice cut through my thoughts. There's more. Crawford's been acquiring land surrounding the ranch for the past 5 years. He controls nearly everything in the county, and if the ranch were to revert to the state, he'd buy it at auction without competition. You think this is about marriage? It's about control. I felt a bitter resolve settle in my chest. Control. For decades, my father's weakness had allowed Crawford to inch closer to what he desired. And now, fate had placed the solution, and the problem, directly in my path. Lila's hand brushed mine as she examined the papers, a fleeting contact that sparked a recognition. We were bound, not just by law, but by survival. Hours passed as Pete guided us through the operational details. Cattle sales, grazing rights, hiring contracts, all meticulously recorded. The ledger spoke of alliances with distant ranchers, shipments of beef to urban markets, debts owed and collected. It became clear that the ranch was not a static inheritance. It was a living enterprise, a machine fueled by meticulous labor, strategic thinking, and the loyalty of men like Pete. That night, the main house felt alive with ghosts. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering in the glow of lantern light, and every floorboard seemed to whisper stories of deals, betrayals, and dreams deferred. Lila and I retired to a small room overlooking the pastures, the wind carrying the lowing of cattle across the fields. Sleep was impossible. The weight of the revelation pressed upon us both. I thought of Crawford. I thought of the money he had offered, the threats veiled beneath civility. $50,000 to walk away. The ranch, the legacy, the power, gone, for mere coin. And yet the thought of submitting, of abandoning the estate my father had fought to secure, filled me with a quiet fury. In the early hours, the sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance. Shadows flitted among the trees, and instinct sharpened every sense. Crawford's reach was long, and his plans meticulous. But I had something he did not: knowledge, understanding, and perhaps, for the first time, the determination to act on it. The following day was consumed by strategy. Pete introduced us to the ranch hands, a loyal cadre of men who had served Blackwood for years, some from his early days, others hired by my father. Their loyalty was cautious at first. We were strangers, after all, thrust into a world of wealth and danger. But as Pete explained the situation, the room shifted. Eyes narrowed, nods of understanding passed silently. They were prepared to stand with us, to defend the ranch, and to ensure that Crawford would not walk away with what was ours. I walked the pastures, observing the livestock, noting the boundaries, the fences, the barns. The ranch was vast, each acre a story, each building a testament to the labor of men long gone. And beneath it all, there was history, a network of old debts, secret agreements, and lingering grudges that demanded careful navigation. In the midst of this, Lila remained composed, her quiet strength a contrast to my simmering anger. She had her reasons, her own fears and compromises, yet her resolve never wavered. In some ways, I realized, her understanding of survival surpassed my own. Where I felt outrage, she measured patience. Where I sought confrontation, she planned subtlety. Together, we were learning that inheritance was not merely a matter of possession. It was negotiation, calculation, and endurance. By the second night, the threat from Crawford became palpable. His scouts had been spotted in the surrounding hills, likely gathering intelligence on our routines, waiting for a weakness to exploit. Pete reinforced doors, stashed rifles strategically, and outlined contingencies should the inevitable confrontation arise. We were preparing not just to inherit a ranch, but to defend a legacy with every ounce of cunning and courage we could muster. The tension became a tangible presence, threading itself through every conversation, every glance, every moment of silence. It was a living thing, reminding us that the past was never truly gone, that debts, monetary, moral, and personal, had a way of finding those who least expected them. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, I realized one undeniable truth: the Blackwood inheritance was more than a gift. It was a crucible, and Lila and I were being tested, forced to navigate history's shadow and emerge not just alive, but triumphant. The stakes were higher than money, higher than property. The stakes were survival, legacy, and the understanding that some debts could not be avoided. They had to be confronted, no matter the cost. The next morning, the ranch awoke to the familiar sounds of livestock and wind sweeping across the hills. Yet beneath the surface, tension throbbed like a hidden pulse. The sun had barely risen when I noticed the first signs that Crawford was already testing us. The fence surrounding the northern pasture had been tampered with, posts loosened, a gate slightly ajar. It wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. I moved quickly, inspecting the damage, my mind racing through possibilities. Pete had already started preparing for sabotage, but this was the first real indication that Crawford wasn't merely waiting for us to falter. He was active, deliberate, and close. I relayed the information to Lila as she walked beside me, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed together. She had a way of reading the situation, seeing beyond the surface, and I trusted her instincts even if the danger made my chest tighten. We spent the morning repairing the fence, strengthening weak points, and checking the perimeter. Pete had introduced us to a handful of the ranch hands who would remain loyal, men whose eyes told me they understood what was at stake. They worked quickly, efficiently, their movements precise, and yet I could see the unease that crept into each of them. We were defending not just a ranch, but a lifetime of labor and legacy. By mid-afternoon, the first real confrontation began. From the hills above, dust clouds hinted at movement. Riders. Crawford's scouts. They circled the property with the intent to intimidate, perhaps even to steal or sabotage before he moved in himself. I grabbed a rifle, the weight of it oddly comforting in my hands, and stationed myself along the edge of the barn with Pete. Lila stayed behind, inside the main house, observing and documenting. Even in her quietude, there was an air of command about her. Calm, precise, and calculating. The scouts dismounted near the southern fence, attempting subtle maneuvers to test our defenses. I signaled to Pete, and he relayed commands to the ranch hands with the efficiency of a seasoned foreman. Shots were fired into the air, loud warnings to keep them at bay. Dust and hoofbeats mixed in a chaotic symphony, but no one was hurt yet. Still, it was clear Crawford was sending a message: we know where you are. We are watching. The afternoon blurred into evening as we fortified the house, the barn, and even the grain storage sheds. Every doorway was secured, every window reinforced. Pete had arranged supplies for a potential siege, stockpiling food, water, and ammunition. I couldn't help but think how surreal it was. A day ago, I had been cleaning stables for a living. Now, I was preparing to defend a sprawling estate against a man whose influence spanned counties. Lila's voice cut through my thoughts as she handed me a set of documents. She had been tracing Crawford's acquisitions of surrounding land, noting patterns in his movements and contacts. He's methodical, she said. Everything we've seen, every threat, every attempt to unsettle us, it's part of a plan. He's been setting this up for years. Nothing is accidental. I nodded, absorbing her words. Crawford's network was vast, and our margin for error slim. Every decision, every movement we made had to be calculated. There could be no hesitation, no second guesses. The ranch, and everything it represented, demanded vigilance, courage, and cleverness beyond anything I had previously known. That night, the ranch was eerily quiet. Fires in the distance, perhaps from neighboring properties, painted the sky in an orange glow, but the wind carried no threat from them. Yet the tension was omnipresent. I slept lightly, rifle close, ears attuned to the slightest sound. Lila slept a few feet away, eyes open half the night, tracing lines on a map she had drawn, planning contingencies, escape routes, and defensive positions. I realized she was no passive participant. She was strategist, planner, and survivalist all at once. Before dawn, we were awakened by a commotion near the northern fence. Someone, or several people, had attempted to cut through the reinforced barrier while we slept. Sparks flew as a metal gate was bent. Splinters from the posts scattered across the ground, and the smell of smoke drifted faintly on the wind. Pete had anticipated it, and we were ready. Men and rifles positioned, eyes scanning the darkness, we waited. A figure emerged, crouched low, moving with stealth. I raised my rifle, heart pounding, and fired a warning shot. The man froze, then disappeared into the night. Footsteps receded. Crawford's scouts had tested our defenses again, and again they had failed. But the message was clear: he would escalate. He would not relent. By mid-morning, I was riding across the property with Pete, inspecting every vulnerable point: gates, pastures, corrals, and hidden pathways. The more I explored, the more I understood the depth of what we had inherited. The ranch was not just land, it was a fortress, a business, and a legacy woven with hidden contracts, debts, and alliances. Every structure, every field had been maintained with precision. Crawford's reach was long, but so too was Blackwood's preparation. Lila joined us in the field, her presence a steadying influence. She carried a notebook filled with sketches, notes, and observations. I realized how valuable her mind was to our survival. Where I saw obstacles, she saw solutions. Where I felt fear, she calculated risk. Together, we began to map a defense, using the terrain, the existing structures, and the loyalty of our hands to create an advantage against Crawford. By afternoon, scouts again tested our perimeter, moving closer to the main house. I stationed myself atop the barn, rifle in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. The tension was a tangible presence, curling in the air like smoke, pressing on our chests. Lila remained in the house, alert, coordinating with Pete, directing men where to position themselves, their loyalty unwavering. Hours passed with no direct confrontation. Crawford was patient, calculating. He had the advantage of knowing the history, the contracts, and the weaknesses of both my father and Blackwood. But he did not know us. He did not know how determined we had become, how willing we were to defend what was ours. As dusk approached, I walked the ridge overlooking the northern pasture. The sun bathed the fields in gold, the distant hills sharp and clear against the fading light. And yet, beneath the beauty, I felt the shadow of Crawford closing in. Every rustle in the brush, every distant hoofbeat, every glint of metal set my nerves on edge. He was clever, relentless, and dangerous. But so were we. That night, we convened in the study, maps spread before us. Lila traced routes, predicted patrols, and suggested contingencies. Pete offered tactical advice from years of working the ranch and surviving its harshest winters. And I realized something crucial. This inheritance was not a gift. It was a challenge, one that demanded every ounce of cunning, courage, and resolve we possessed. By the time the candle burned low, a plan was emerging. We would hold the ranch, not by brute force alone, but by anticipation, intelligence, and the loyalty of those who served the estate. Crawford could send men, spies, and threats, but he could not account for strategy born from understanding, from preparation, and from sheer determination. As I lay awake that night, listening to the distant calls of cattle and the rustle of wind in the trees, I understood that this was only the beginning. Crawford had tested us, but he had not yet struck in earnest. The war for Blackwood Ranch had begun, and Lila and I were at the center of it. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, every creak of floorboard reminded me that survival depended on more than courage. It depended on awareness, unity, and the willingness to confront history head-on. And as dawn approached, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, bound not by choice, but by necessity, and perhaps, over time, by trust. The first strike came just as the morning mist began to lift from the pastures. I had barely mounted my horse to check the eastern fence when the sound of distant gunfire shattered the quiet. My heart skipped a beat as instinct took over. The sharp report echoed across the hills, followed by the pounding of hooves and shouted commands. Crawford was making his move. I urged my horse forward, scanning the horizon. Dust rose in swirling clouds, betraying the movements of his men. At least a dozen riders, armed and determined, were advancing toward the ranch buildings, their intentions unmistakable. Pete and the ranch hands were already stationed at key points, rifles ready, eyes focused. Lila remained in the main house, coordinating and observing, her voice calm but commanding as she directed movements through shouted orders and signals. I reached the northern gate just as two of Crawford's scouts tried to force it open. I fired warning shots, bullets thudding into the fence posts and dirt nearby. They faltered, their horses skidding in the mud, and I signaled Pete. The men responded quickly, surrounding the intruders and forcing them back. This was no mere intimidation anymore, it was a direct assault, a test of our resolve and our readiness. From my vantage point atop the barn, I could see Crawford himself riding at the head of his group, a silhouette against the rising sun. His presence was almost ceremonial, as if he wanted us to recognize that this was personal, calculated, and deliberate. Every man under his command moved with precision, clearly trained, clearly prepared for a confrontation. I felt the weight of the ranch pressing down on me. This was no longer a game of legal documents or inheritance. It was a battle for survival, for control, for legacy. Shots rang out intermittently, not aimed directly at us, but enough to unsettle the livestock and test our defensive responses. The cattle stampeded briefly, controlled chaos that the ranch hands quickly managed. Lila's voice carried across the yard, firm and precise, directing each of us like a seasoned commander. Her composure under fire was astonishing. I realized that her presence was not just a requirement of the contract, it was vital to our defense. The fight lasted for hours in bursts, feints, advances, retreats. Crawford's men tested every vulnerable point, probing for weaknesses in fences, doors, and gates. Each attempt was met with resistance. We had anticipated many of his strategies, but he was adaptive, learning quickly, forcing us to think several steps ahead. Every engagement left us tense, every minor victory tempered by the knowledge that the real confrontation was yet to come. By midday, we had inflicted enough hesitation in Crawford's men to force them to pull back temporarily. Smoke from the fires they set for diversion curled into the sky, carrying the acrid scent of burned wood and hay. We moved quickly to extinguish the smaller fires and reinforce the areas they had targeted. The ranch, once peaceful and routine, now hummed with urgency and tension, every corner a potential threat. Lila and I met briefly in the study, going over maps and notes. She had already identified patterns in Crawford's assaults, predicting where he might strike next. "He's testing us," she said quietly. "Every small fire, every fence tampered with, it's a signal. He's mapping our responses, learning our limits." I nodded, absorbing her insight. Her strategic mind complemented my own instincts. Together, we began to see a path forward, not just to survive, but to reclaim initiative. By late afternoon, a tense calm settled over the ranch. Crawford's men had withdrawn to regroup, their presence still a looming threat on the outskirts of the property. We used the lull to repair damage, resupply ammunition, and tend to the livestock. The ranch hands, weary but resolute, followed our lead. It became clear that loyalty and determination were as powerful as any weapon in this conflict. As night fell, we prepared for the possibility of a second, more coordinated strike. Every door was reinforced, every window barricaded, and every hidden path monitored. Pete shared stories of previous ranch sieges and defensive tactics, blending experience with practical advice. Lila and I strategized, mapping patrols, escape routes, and fallback positions. The entire property became a fortress, each of us acutely aware that any misstep could be catastrophic. Sleep was scarce. I lay awake on the loft floor, listening to the wind, the lowing of cattle, and the faint rustle of leaves. Each sound carried potential danger. I thought about my father and Jonathan Blackwood, about contracts signed decades ago, debts owed, and the intricate web that had led to this moment. This inheritance was never meant to be easy. It was a crucible, testing courage, intelligence, and loyalty. Before dawn, a messenger arrived on horseback from a neighboring property. A brief exchange of words confirmed our fears. Crawford had secured alliances, purchasing loyalty through promises and fear. He was not alone, and his next strike would be larger, more dangerous. The stakes had escalated beyond property or money. This was a battle for survival, for the preservation of a legacy forged through years of labor, sacrifice, and cunning. The following days were a relentless mix of defense, repair, and intelligence gathering. Crawford's movements were closely monitored, every signal interpreted, every small skirmish a lesson in his tactics. Lila's strategic mind, Pete's practical experience, and the ranch hand's loyalty formed a formidable combination. Each night we regrouped, planned, and reinforced. Each day we faced Crawford's provocations with calculated responses. Through it all, a bond grew between Lila and me, forged not in affection but in shared struggle. We learned each other's instincts, anticipating movements, understanding reactions, and trusting judgment. This partnership, born of necessity, became an essential weapon in itself. Without it, the ranch, and perhaps our lives, would be lost. By the end of the week, we were exhausted but resilient. Crawford's first strike had failed to break us, but it had revealed his methods, his patience, and his ruthless determination. We had survived, but the war for Blackwood Ranch was only beginning. The next confrontation promised to be larger, deadlier, and more decisive. As the sun set over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across the pastures, I realized something undeniable. This inheritance was not simply a matter of wealth. It was a test of character, strategy, and endurance. Every man, woman, and animal on the ranch had a role to play. Every decision mattered. Every moment demanded vigilance. And as night fell, I felt a resolute certainty. We would defend Blackwood Ranch, not just because it was ours by law, but because it represented the culmination of decades of effort, sacrifice, and legacy. Crawford might strike again, but we were ready. We were no longer mere inheritors. We were defenders, strategists, and survivors. The first strike had come, and we had survived. The battle was far from over, but the message was clear: we would not yield. The ranch, and everything it stood for, would remain ours. And as I looked across the moonlit fields, I knew the fight ahead would define us, not just as inheritors, but as a force to be reckoned with. The following morning, the ranch awoke to an eerie quiet. After the first strike, one would expect a lull, but I had learned that Crawford was patient, and patience made him dangerous. Lila and I moved quietly through the main house, checking locks, securing doors, and reviewing the perimeter. Pete was already outside, walking the fence lines with a practiced eye, identifying weak points and noting where the previous assault had been most aggressive. I felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on me. This wasn't just about property or wealth anymore. Each decision could cost lives, and each failure would grant Crawford an advantage. The ranch had become a chessboard, and we were the pieces he sought to manipulate. By mid-morning, the first signs of sabotage appeared. The water trough in the northern pasture had been tampered with, contaminated with a bitter, foul-tasting mixture. One of the younger ranch hands noticed it before the livestock could drink, and the damage was contained, but the message was unmistakable. Crawford was not only testing our defenses, he was willing to strike at the very lifeblood of the ranch. Lila examined the contamination with meticulous care. Her knowledge of chemistry was limited, but she understood enough to neutralize the immediate threat and trace its origins. "He's clever," she said quietly, eyes narrowing. "This isn't random. He's calculating every move, trying to weaken us gradually, erode our confidence before the next strike." I rode the ridges, scanning the horizon, my rifle slung across my back. From my vantage point, the sprawling field seemed calm, but I knew better. Crawford's men were out there, hidden among trees, behind hills, observing, waiting for the perfect moment. Every rustle, every flicker of movement could be a scout or an ambush. Every shadow held a potential threat. As the sun climbed higher, a message arrived by courier, an unmarked envelope containing only a note in Crawford's familiar, neat handwriting. "You cannot hide. The ranch will be mine." It was both a threat and a promise. The audacity of it sent a chill down my spine, but it also reinforced the reality. We had to act, not just react. Pete gathered the men for a strategy session. "They'll try another strike today," he said, scanning our defenses. "But this time, they might hit us in ways we can't anticipate. Fires, poison, tampering. Keep your eyes open, stay sharp, and trust your instincts. Crawford doesn't play fair, and neither can we." We divided responsibilities. Lila and I coordinated the defense of the main house and the barn. Pete supervised the patrols and managed the ranch hands. We reinforced water sources, food supplies, and communication lines. Every building had a contingency plan. Every exit had a fallback route. The ranch had become a fortress, layered with traps, defenses, and contingencies. By late afternoon, the second strike came, not from the front, not from the north, but from the western side, where we had assumed no immediate threat. Smoke curled from the corral near the horse pens. We raced toward it, hearts pounding. Crawford's men had attempted to ignite the hayloft. Quick thinking and a bucket brigade extinguished the fire before it could spread, but the message was clear. He had learned our patterns. While we fought the flames, Lila discovered evidence of tampering in the barn doors. Locks had been picked, hinges loosened, and footprints indicated scouts had been inside while we were unaware. The reality hit me with full force. Crawford's network extended deep into the property. He had insiders, or at least men who could move without detection. We could not let our guard down for a single moment. Night fell, but sleep did not come. We patrolled, mapped the perimeter again, and reinforced weak points. I caught myself staring at every shadow, every flicker of movement, questioning the loyalty of every hand. Trust became a currency more valuable than gold. The ranch had become a battlefield, and every decision could tip the scales. Then came the betrayal. One of the newer hands, a man we had thought reliable, was discovered attempting to relay information to Crawford's scouts. Pete confronted him quietly, but the damage was already done. Details about our defensive strategies, our routines, and our vulnerabilities had been exposed. The sting of betrayal was sharp, cutting deeper than any threat from outside. Lila and I met in the study, the weight of the revelation heavy on both of us. "He knows more than we anticipated," she said, tracing the movements of Crawford's men on the map. "Every tactic we've used has been observed. We need to change our strategy completely." I nodded, determination hardening in my chest. We could not allow fear or betrayal to dictate our actions. The ranch was ours, not just by law, but by legacy. Crawford might have planned, manipulated, and schemed, but he had not accounted for our resolve, our intelligence, and our unity. Over the next few days, we adapted. Patrols were randomized, guards shifted positions, and communication became coded. We reinforced structures, secured all food and water supplies, and set up hidden observation points. Every building, every pasture, every ridge became part of a complex network of defense. The ranch was alive with vigilance. Crawford struck again at dawn on the 5th day. This time, his men attempted a coordinated attack on multiple fronts, horses, fences, and even the main house simultaneously. But we were ready. Lila's strategic adjustments allowed us to anticipate his moves, and Pete's experience ensured that every response was precise. Smoke, gunfire, and the sounds of chaos filled the morning, but the ranch held firm. By midday, Crawford's forces had retreated once more. We had inflicted enough resistance to force a temporary withdrawal, but it was clear that he would not relent. His persistence, combined with his willingness to use any means necessary, made him a formidable adversary. We regrouped, tending to minor injuries, repairing damage, and reinforcing defenses once more. The ranch hands, exhausted but unbroken, took comfort in our leadership and the visible evidence of their efforts making a difference. Lila and I began to see the pattern emerging. Crawford was methodical, calculating, and ruthless, but his predictability was becoming our advantage. As the sun set over the western hills, I realized something profound. This battle for Blackwood Ranch was more than a fight for land or inheritance. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and unity. Every person, every decision, every action had a ripple effect. We were no longer passive inheritors. We were defenders, strategists, and leaders of a community bound by loyalty and purpose. The betrayal had cut deep, the sabotage had challenged us, and the threats had escalated. But through it all, a sense of clarity emerged. Crawford had underestimated us. He had assumed fear, hesitation, and division would define our response. Instead, he faced coordination, intelligence, and resolve. And as night settled over the ranch, the distant lights of Crawford's encampments flickering across the hills, I knew the next confrontation would be decisive. The stakes had never been higher. The ranch, the legacy, and the lives tied to it hung in the balance. We were ready. We had adapted. We had survived. And come the next dawn, we would meet Crawford's forces head-on, not just with defense, but with a strategy that would turn his own ambition against him. Dawn broke with a heavy copper sky, casting long shadows across the ranch. I stood atop the barn roof, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for any sign of Crawford's forces. This was it, the culmination of days of sabotage, betrayal, and skirmishes. Every nerve in my body was taut, every sense heightened. Lila joined me silently, eyes scanning the hills with practiced focus. No words were necessary. We understood each other completely. By first light, we spotted movement in the far valley. Crawford had assembled his largest force yet. Riders, armed and determined, moved in a deliberate formation, as if rehearsing a battle long in the making. Smoke curled from small fires, part of his diversion, and the sound of hooves echoed across the plains like a drumbeat of war. I descended from the barn to rally our forces. The ranch hands, though exhausted from previous strikes, were resolute. Each had been trained, briefed, and mentally prepared for this moment. Pete organized defensive positions around the main house, barn, and corral. Every approach, every potential weak point, had been fortified. The ranch had become a living fortress. As Crawford's men approached, it became clear he was using everything at his disposal. Scouts, fire starters, and hidden marksmen worked in unison. His plan was not a simple raid, it was a coordinated effort to overwhelm us, test our defenses, and force surrender. Every decision we made now would have immediate consequences. The first clash erupted at the corral. Crawford's men attempted to stampede our horses, but quick reflexes and well-placed barriers diverted the animals safely. Bullets flew, shattering wood and stone, but casualties were minimal thanks to our preparation. Each ranch hand moved with precision, following the plan we had developed over days of anticipation. From the barn roof, I took careful aim, targeting key figures among the attackers. Lila moved fluidly, coordinating signals, ensuring we remained organized amidst the chaos. Our communication was seamless, our coordination almost instinctive. Crawford's forces began to falter, unable to break through our defenses. Hours passed in a tense standoff. Smoke and dust hung thick in the air, punctuated by the sharp report of firearms and shouted orders. Crawford's persistence was formidable, but we had learned his patterns, adapted to his tactics, and anticipated his moves. Each failed maneuver drained him, eroding the confidence of his men. In the midst of battle, I noticed a smaller group attempting to flank the barn from the east. Lila and I quickly devised a counterattack, using the terrain to our advantage. Narrow gullies and ridges allowed us to funnel them into a kill zone, where Pete and the ranch hands awaited with rifles trained and ready. The flanking attempt was neutralized efficiently, reinforcing our control of the battlefield. By midday, Crawford himself appeared near the main gate, attempting a direct confrontation. His presence exuded authority and menace, but the desperation in his eyes betrayed his frustration. Lila and I coordinated with Pete, positioning ourselves strategically to cut off any escape or surprise attacks. Every move he made was countered with precision. The tide of the battle began to turn. Crawford's forces, though numerous, were disorganized and demoralized. We had exploited their overconfidence and lack of knowledge of the terrain. Small victories mounted, and soon the attackers were retreating toward the valley, pursued cautiously to prevent ambushes. In the aftermath, the ranch was scarred but intact. Smoke from minor fires lingered, and scattered debris marked the paths of the battle. Our losses were few, thanks to careful planning and the unwavering loyalty of the ranch hands. The battle had tested every skill, every ounce of courage, and every measure of trust between Lila and me. Crawford himself had disappeared amidst the retreat, but we knew it was temporary. He would return, more cunning and dangerous than ever. But the message was clear: the ranch was defended, and its defenders would not yield. The land, the livestock, and the legacy of the Blackwood estate were safe, for now. That night, we gathered in the main house, tending to minor injuries and assessing the damage. Lila and I mapped out the next steps, planning for fortifications, reinforcements, and intelligence gathering. Each strategy was a lesson learned from the battle, a preparation for the inevitable next confrontation. I walked through the pastures under the moonlight, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Every fence, every building, every acre was a testament to resilience, loyalty, and determination. Crawford's ambitions would not define the ranch. We would. The next dawn promised another challenge, but I felt a profound sense of confidence. We had faced the first major assault, adapted, and emerged stronger. The battle for Blackwood Ranch was far from over, but for the first time, I believed victory was possible. Not just survival, but true control over our inherited legacy. And as I looked toward the distant hills, where shadows hinted at future threats, I knew one undeniable truth. This ranch, and everything it represented, would not fall without a fight. Crawford might regroup, strategize, and strike again, but we were ready. Our unity, our intelligence, and our courage had forged a defense no single adversary could easily overcome. The ultimate confrontation was not just about land or wealth. It was a test of character, of endurance, and of legacy. Every day, every decision, and every battle etched the story of Blackwood Ranch deeper into the annals of history. And we would fight to ensure that the legacy remained ours, intact and unbroken. The calm after battle was deceptive. For a brief moment, the ranch seemed safe, bathed in golden sunlight with livestock grazing peacefully and the faint scent of smoke still lingering from yesterday's fight. But I knew better. Crawford was patient, cunning, and relentless. He would not give up so easily. The quiet was only the prelude to a more dangerous storm. Lila and I moved through the ranch, inspecting the aftermath. Damaged fences were repaired, gates reinforced, and minor fires extinguished. Every structural repair was a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. Pete supervised from the barn, his eyes scanning the horizon, a silent sentinel who had grown into more than just a caretaker. He was our shield, our strategist, our backbone. Then, the courier arrived. No envelope this time, just a single, sealed bottle of whiskey, placed conspicuously at the main gate. Inside, a note. For courage, and for the inevitable next meeting. C. Crawford had returned, and with him came not only threat but psychological warfare. This wasn't just about brute force, it was about intimidation, manipulation, and forcing us to question ourselves. As evening fell, whispers of unease rippled among the ranch hands. There was talk of spies, of men who had seemed loyal but might secretly relay information to Crawford. The betrayal earlier in the week had shaken us, but now the specter of further treachery hung over every decision. Trust was fragile, and yet it was our only weapon against the unseen enemy. I called a meeting in the study, bringing Lila, Pete, and the senior ranch hands together. The discussion was tense. Each report of suspicious behavior, each unexplained absence, each fleeting glance outside the windows was analyzed. We established rotation shifts, secret signals, and coded messages to ensure communication remained secure. Every hand on the ranch now understood that vigilance was survival. Night fell fully, and the first signs of Crawford's new plan became clear. Fires began igniting in small clusters along the outskirts of the property, clearly intended to draw our attention and divide our forces. But this time, we anticipated the diversion. Lila had scouted escape routes for the animals, strategically placed water sources to limit damage, and organized teams to contain the flames. Every fire was met with precision, extinguished before it could escalate. But it wasn't just fire. Sabotage now extended into supply lines. Feed barrels had been punctured, water channels blocked, and minor machinery tampered with. These were small acts, easily contained individually, but collectively they threatened the ranch's operation. Crawford was not attacking with overwhelming force. He was attacking with patience, method, and psychological warfare. The night deepened, and with it came the storm, a literal one. Lightning illuminated the ridges, revealing fleeting figures moving in the distance. Rain began pouring, turning dust into mud, further complicating movement and visibility. Yet, amid the chaos, a deeper treachery revealed itself. One of the senior ranch hands, someone we had relied upon for years, was discovered attempting to signal an outsider across the ridges. The betrayal cut deeper than any attack. It threatened to unravel everything we had built. Pete confronted him quietly, but the man's expression was of cold calculation, revealing that Crawford's influence extended farther than we had feared. Lila and I discussed the implications, realizing that our enemy had infiltrated not only physically but psychologically. Every plan, every defense we established could be undermined from within. By dawn, we had isolated the betrayer, restructured our defenses, and reinforced every vulnerable position. Crawford's patience had forced us into a crucible, refining our strategies, hardening our resolve. We began to anticipate his tactics in ways he would not expect. Days passed in tense vigilance. Every noise, every shadow was scrutinized. Crawford's attempts to manipulate us were met with coordinated resistance. He tried to exploit fear, disunity, and confusion, but instead, his actions strengthened our cohesion. The ranch was no longer just a collection of buildings and pastures. It had become a fortress of strategy, vigilance, and unwavering determination. Then came the intelligence breakthrough. Lila discovered coded messages hidden in seemingly innocuous correspondences sent to the town's general store. Through careful analysis, she realized Crawford was orchestrating a complex plan to strike not directly at the ranch, but at its supply lines and surrounding territory. He aimed to isolate us completely, to starve the ranch into submission. Armed with this knowledge, we devised a counterplan. Scouts were dispatched under the cover of darkness to intercept Crawford's supply lines. Hidden trenches and defensive positions were established along the ridges. Communication networks were expanded with runners and signals, ensuring that no movement went unnoticed. Every action was calculated to anticipate Crawford's next move. Despite the tension, there were moments of human connection. Lila and I shared quiet conversations, mapping strategies and sharing stories of resilience. The bond between us, forged in the fires of conflict, became a source of strength. We were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. We were partners, allies, and co-defenders of the Blackwood legacy. Then, the climactic moment arrived. Crawford made his move, attempting a multi-pronged attack aimed at cutting off water, food, and communication. But this time, we were ready. Each team executed its role flawlessly, turning his complex plan into a trap. Riders were intercepted, supplies secured, and his men were driven back, disoriented and demoralized. Crawford himself arrived too late, witnessing the unraveling of his intricate scheme. His expression was a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had underestimated not just our resilience, but our intelligence and unity. Every betrayal he orchestrated, every fire he set, every act of sabotage had ultimately strengthened us, preparing us for this very confrontation. By nightfall, Crawford retreated once more, leaving behind the smoldering remnants of failed attempts and a clear message. He would return, but so would we. The ranch, though battered, stood strong. The betrayal had been addressed, the sabotage neutralized, and the enemy's intentions laid bare. As I stood on the ridge, looking out over the sprawling fields, barns, and pastures of Blackwood Ranch, I realized that every challenge had forged us into more than survivors. We were strategists, leaders, and protectors of a legacy that spanned generations. Crawford's return had revealed the depth of his cunning, but also the depth of our resolve. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars piercing the darkness. I felt the weight of responsibility, but also the clarity of purpose. The ranch was ours, not just in law, but in spirit, defended by loyalty, intelligence, and courage. And as the wind whispered through the cedar trees, I knew that the final confrontation, when it would come, would not be won by fear or force alone, but by the unity, strategy, and resolve we had forged through fire, betrayal, and relentless challenge. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant howl of wolves and the creak of old wood settling in the barns. We had survived Crawford's previous attacks, but every moment of quiet carried a tension that threatened to snap. Lila and I moved through the property under the dim light of lanterns, inspecting every fence, every doorway, every possible entry point. The ranch was our fortress, and soon, it would be tested like never before. Pete had taken command of the defensive positions, coordinating a small, elite team of ranch hands who had proven their loyalty beyond question. Each man and woman knew the stakes. Failure meant the loss of the Blackwood legacy, the land we had fought to protect, and possibly our lives. Despite the small number of defenders, each one was skilled, determined, and prepared for sacrifice. Maps were spread across the main house table, illuminated by a single flickering candle. Hills, valleys, and hidden passes were marked with meticulous detail. Lila and I traced the paths where Crawford could strike, calculating likely approaches and setting traps along every conceivable route. Our minds worked like clockwork, every plan layered with contingencies. We knew Crawford's temperament. He was not reckless, he was cunning and methodical. His previous attacks had been designed to test us, to reveal our weaknesses, and now he would strike decisively, leaving nothing to chance. That knowledge was both terrifying and empowering. We would meet his precision with our own. By midnight, the storm began. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dry dirt paths into slick mud. Thunder echoed across the hills, masking movement and adding an ominous rhythm to the night. We used the storm to our advantage, positioning sentries along ridges where visibility was low but elevation provided a tactical edge. Supplies were organized with military precision. Every barrel of food, every crate of ammunition, every rope and lantern had a specific purpose and location. We moved like a well-oiled machine, each task completed efficiently, leaving nothing to chance. Lila's keen eye caught details others might have missed: a loose shutter, a narrow gap in the barn wall, a subtle indentation where an intruder could hide. Nothing escaped her attention. The first sign of Crawford's approach came at 2 a.m., a distant rustling on the ridge above the northern pasture. Shadows moved deliberately, cloaked by darkness and rain. I signaled to Pete, who adjusted the sentries and readied a trap along the likely path. Lila and I took positions atop the barn roof, rifles trained, eyes scanning the stormy horizon. The tension was absolute. Each movement, each whisper of wind, each snap of a twig seemed magnified, echoing through the pounding of my heart. Crawford's forces were smaller than expected, but that only made them more dangerous. They were elite, carefully selected, and trained to exploit weakness. The first wave arrived at the outer fence. Silent, precise, and deadly. But we had anticipated this. Pete's team activated hidden barriers, forcing them into choke points where our rifles could be most effective. The attackers faltered, confusion spreading among them as they realized our preparation exceeded their expectations. Bullets flashed in the storm, sparks flying where metal struck metal. Lila's calm voice directed our defense, every order precise and unhesitating. The attackers pressed, but each advance met calculated resistance. The ranch itself seemed alive, every building, fence, and pasture used as a weapon in our arsenal. Hours stretched on. The rain turned to sleet, numbing fingers and obscuring vision, but we held our ground. Crawford's forces were relentless, testing every weak point, every strategy we had employed. But the preparation, discipline, and unity we had forged through previous skirmishes allowed us to repel wave after wave. Amid the chaos, I realized the final test was not just physical, it was psychological. Crawford's presence was a shadow over every move we made, a whisper in the back of our minds suggesting futility. But we refused to yield. Every decision was deliberate, every action calculated to reinforce our position and preserve the ranch. Then, the moment arrived when Crawford attempted his final maneuver, a concentrated strike aimed directly at the barn, the nerve center of our defense. Lila and I coordinated with Pete, using the terrain, traps, and defensive positions to funnel his men into exposed zones. The strike was met with overwhelming resistance. Ambushes, hidden trenches, and precise fire turned his attack into a devastating failure. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the land battered but under our control. Crawford's forces were scattered, defeated, and demoralized. The ranch stood, scarred but intact, a testament to strategy, loyalty, and unyielding will. The final siege had been survived, not by numbers, but by precision, preparation, and the courage of a few determined souls. As I walked through the wet pastures, inspecting the aftermath, I felt a strange calm. The night had tested every skill, every ounce of courage, every layer of trust between us. And we had prevailed. Crawford had been forced to retreat, leaving behind only the memory of his ambitions and the reminder that the Blackwood legacy was defended at any cost. This night had solidified more than our control over the land. It had forged an unbreakable bond among those who defended it. Lila, Pete, and the remaining ranch hands were no longer just allies. They were the embodiment of resilience, strategy, and honor. The legacy of Blackwood Ranch was secure, not by luck or chance, but by deliberate, unwavering action. And as the first light of dawn broke over the hills, illuminating the pastures, barns, and stone walls, I realized one undeniable truth. The final battle might have been fought, but the legacy we protected would endure far beyond the storm, beyond Crawford's schemes, and beyond the fleeting shadows of fear that had haunted us. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when the first movement appeared across the northern ridge. Crawford had returned, smaller in number but sharper, more ruthless. His eyes burned with the fury of a man who had underestimated his opponent too many times. I watched from the barn roof as he signaled his men, every gesture calculated to intimidate. We had anticipated this. The trenches were dug, the hidden posts manned, and the signal system ready. Lila and I exchanged a brief nod. No words were needed. Every action, every step, every shot would count. Crawford believed he could corner us, force our surrender, but he underestimated the unity we had forged through fire and betrayal. The first wave approached the outer fence, boots sinking into mud, rifles raised. We held fire until they were in range. Then came the chaos. Shots rang out, smoke filled the air, and the horses stampeded in panic, adding confusion to the assault. But our traps worked flawlessly. Barrels rolled, pitfalls claimed the unwary, and every advance was met with precise resistance. Crawford tried to flank us, moving through a narrow ravine to reach the barn. I met him halfway, rifle aimed, heart steady. Every instinct screamed tension, every sense sharpened. He moved like a predator, but this time, the prey had prepared. One shot, calculated, disarmed his lead man. Another, a flash, drove him back. His flanking maneuver failed, and he realized, too late, that his plans were unraveling. Hours passed, the battle brutal but precise. Lila's commands cut through the chaos, Pete's strength anchored the defense, and I moved like a shadow, striking when needed, covering gaps, coordinating fire. Crawford's men faltered, their resolve weakening as each attempt met resistance beyond their expectation. Finally, Crawford confronted me directly, face twisted with rage. Words were unnecessary. The struggle was physical, mental, and symbolic. Every strike I parried, every maneuver I countered, told him one truth. The Blackwood legacy would not fall to threats or deception. As the sun rose fully, Crawford's remaining men fled, leaving him alone, exhausted and defeated. He glared, vowing vengeance, but retreat was inevitable. The ranch stood intact, every pasture, every barn, every acre preserved. The storm had passed. The siege was over. We had survived not by numbers but by strategy, unity, and courage. Crawford's final stand was nothing more than a lesson in underestimating those who fight for what is rightfully theirs. And as I looked over Blackwood Ranch, the land stretched vast and secure, a silent promise that we were its true guardians. The calm of the evening was deceptive. Crawford wasn't gone, he was regrouping, planning his retaliation with meticulous precision. By the time the first stars appeared, I knew we wouldn't have long before his next move. The ranch was quiet but alert. Pete and the remaining hands reinforced fences, checked traps, and prepared the livestock for potential chaos. Lila moved among us, her eyes scanning every shadow, her voice steady but urgent. He'll test us again. Expect feints, distractions, anything to break our focus. And he did. Within hours, smoke appeared on the western ridge, not a direct attack, but enough to draw our attention. I followed Lila and Pete as we raced to investigate, only to find a series of diversions. Fires set in small, unimportant fields, false signals of movement. Crawford was probing, looking for weaknesses, and the storm of the previous night had taught me that he would exploit any lapse. We countered. Every diversion was neutralized before it could escalate. Horses were guided away from the smoke, and hidden paths blocked. Every step, every action, was a lesson in anticipation and preparation. Crawford wanted us reacting, but we moved with intention, turning his strategy into his failure. The true test came at midnight. Crawford sent a concentrated strike, fast-moving men through the hills aiming to seize the barn and its strategic vantage. Lila and I were ready. Hidden positions, traps, and barricades slowed their advance. Pete and the ranch hands picked them off systematically. The night echoed with gunfire, shouting, and the pounding of hooves, but our defenses held. During the chaos, I realized something crucial. Crawford underestimated us not only because of our preparation, but because he never accounted for our resolve. He had assumed fear would dominate, that Cora and I would falter in the face of danger. But every challenge had strengthened our bond and sharpened our strategy. By dawn, Crawford's strike had been repelled. He retreated again, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and a trail of frustrated men. The ranch stood scarred but intact, the victory hard-won yet decisive. We had defended Blackwood not through sheer force, but through foresight, unity, and relentless focus. As the sun rose over the pastures, I felt the weight of our accomplishments. Crawford's repeated attacks had tested every skill, every instinct. And we had survived. But I knew this was not the end. Each engagement had been a lesson, each battle a warning. The final confrontation was coming, and only one side would claim the legacy of Blackwood Ranch. The first light of dawn broke over Blackwood Ranch, painting the pastures gold. But there was no peace. Crawford's men were advancing, a small army determined to take what they believed was theirs. I stood on the main porch, rifle in hand, heart steady. Lila, Pete, and the loyal ranch hands were positioned strategically, every vantage point covered. Crawford himself emerged at the front of his force, a shadow of the confident man who had once tried to intimidate us. His eyes met mine across the field, and I saw something I hadn't expected: hesitation. He had underestimated the changes we had made, the traps, the fortifications, and the unity that had grown among us. The attack began with a volley of gunfire, but we had anticipated it. Barrels rolled, pits claimed the overzealous, and concealed rifles found their marks. Chaos erupted among Crawford's men, but our defenses held firm. I moved with precision, covering blind spots, directing reinforcements, and striking where the enemy least expected. Crawford attempted to flank us, moving quickly through a ravine to reach the barn. Pete intercepted him, rifle steady, every shot measured and lethal. Lila guided the ranch hands to block escape routes, while I ensured the cattle were moved safely, preventing panic from adding to the chaos. Amid the battle, I found myself facing Crawford alone. Words were unnecessary. Our gazes spoke volumes. He lunged, desperation fueling his attacks. I countered, parrying, dodging, and using the terrain to my advantage. Every second felt stretched, each movement a matter of survival. The fight was as much about wit as strength, a duel between cunning and fury. Finally, Crawford faltered, exhaustion and miscalculation leaving him vulnerable. With one decisive maneuver, I disarmed him, sending his rifle skidding across the dirt. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily, defeated. The remaining men scattered, their morale shattered. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The ranch, though scarred and bruised from the assault, stood intact. Every pasture, barn, and fence remained under our control. The legacy of Blackwood was secure, preserved through strategy, courage, and unwavering loyalty. As Crawford was escorted away, I looked over the land. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, but the lessons of the battle lingered. Ownership was more than property. It was vigilance, wisdom, and the courage to fight for what was right. Lila and I shared a glance, a silent understanding passing between us. We had survived the storm together. And in that moment, I realized the truth of the legacy. Blackwood Ranch was more than land or wealth. It was a testament to resilience, unity, and the enduring strength of those who dared to protect it. The battle was over, but the story, our story, had only just begun. The dust had barely settled when the sun rose fully over Blackwood Ranch, casting golden light across the rolling pastures, the barns, and the houses that had endured so much in the past days. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the tension of imminent danger weighing on my chest. Crawford was gone, his men scattered, his schemes laid bare and crushed. The final battle had ended, but the aftermath was just as significant as the conflict itself. Lila walked beside me on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon as if ensuring the land we had fought for was truly safe. The ranch was alive again, not just with the livestock and the gentle movement of workers, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent before. Each person who had stood with us during the attacks carried not only their physical labor but a piece of trust, courage, and loyalty that now defined the true foundation of Blackwood Ranch. I wandered through the main house, touching the ledgers, the maps, the documents that had once seemed like abstract numbers and lines. Now, they felt like the pulse of this land, the culmination of decades of work and sacrifices. Jonathan Blackwood's foresight had been astonishing. Every secret contract, every hidden agreement, every carefully orchestrated contingency had been designed to protect the legacy from those who would exploit it. And now it was ours. Not just mine, but all of ours who had fought, suffered, and survived together. Cora, my partner through fire, deceit, and danger, stood by the barn, her hands brushing the fence rails as she watched the cattle graze peacefully. I realized that the woman I had first met only weeks ago, bewildered and forced into circumstances she never imagined, had transformed before my eyes. She was no longer just a participant in this inheritance. She was a guardian, a strategist, and a force equal to any of us. Her strength had been quiet but formidable, her wisdom emerging in moments when even I questioned our next step. The betrayal that had once shaken us, the traitor within, was now a lesson rather than a wound. Trust had been tested, loyalty proven, and the bonds forged in adversity could never be broken. Pete and the remaining ranch hands moved about the property, rebuilding, reinforcing, and ensuring that the land would thrive long after any human conflicts passed. They were not just employees, they were protectors of a legacy that was bigger than any single person. As the weeks passed, life began to settle into a rhythm that had seemed impossible just a month ago. Markets were secured, buyers satisfied, and the ranch's operations ran smoother than I could have imagined. Yet, the real inheritance was not measured in acres, livestock, or contracts. It was measured in resilience, unity, and the strength to endure the past while building a future. I stood atop the ridge one evening, Cora at my side, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The land stretched endlessly, peaceful, untouched by the greed and violence that had sought to claim it. And I understood, with every fiber of my being, that this legacy was now truly ours. Not inherited by chance, not taken by force, but earned through courage, wisdom, and the willingness to face the darkest of human schemes without yielding. Crawford would never return, but even if he had, he would find that the spirit of Blackwood Ranch was not in its fences, its buildings, or even its cattle. It was in the hearts of those who loved it, protected it, and believed in it. And in that moment, I knew something profoundly simple yet eternal. Land, legacy, and life were inseparable when defended by those willing to sacrifice everything to preserve them. As night fell, stars spread across the sky like silver flecks on black velvet. I watched them with Cora, feeling the weight of the past, the intensity of the battles fought, and the quiet triumph of surviving together. The wind whispered through the grass, through the trees, and across the barn rooftops, carrying with it the echoes of every decision, every action, every choice that had led us here. Blackwood Ranch was more than a place, it was a testament. A testament to resilience, to loyalty, and to the unyielding spirit of those who refused to surrender to greed, betrayal, or fear. And as I looked over the land that stretched endlessly before me, I felt a quiet, unshakable truth settle deep within. This was home, this was our legacy, and no one, not Crawford, not fate, not even time itself, could ever take it from us. For the first time, in the silence that followed every storm, I smiled. If you were in the main character's place, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like the video. Discover more stories by checking out the other videos on your screen.